All right, now, a lot of you have asked me the question about my views on the Jesus, what do they call themselves? Seminole, yeah. Okay. Now, Tom is a gentleman. He called them silly. I'm a farmer who's come in from the village with manure on my shoes, and I call them stupid. Now, stupid because they have not considered the source, namely Middle Eastern traditional village life. Nobody's bothered to even ask. Now, they don't want to ask because, as Luke Johnson, in a very brilliant review of that whole effort that is in Christian Century, of all places, I mean, not exactly conservative evangelical journal, and Johnson clobbers them from a critical scientific New Testament point of view. And it's very, very well done. He says they started off with their own affirmation. The Christian faith is a bunch of baloney, and then they set out to prove this with what they do. I don't approach it from that point of view. I approach it from the point of view of my own 40 years working with traditional village life and observing how they pass on what is important to them. Things like, how was our village founded and who are we? The stories which encapsulate their identity. How is this stuff passed on? It's passed on in what is called the Haflat Samar. Hafla means a party, and Samar in Arabic cognates with the Hebrew Shamara, from which the word Samaria comes, which means to preserve. This is a party for preservation. This sounds like the dullest party you ever heard in your life. It isn't. They are utterly fascinating, and before the coming of television, which will probably wipe all of this out, or most of it, not all of it, but most of it, before the coming of television, this was the form of entertainment in village life everywhere. You gather together in the evening and you tell stories, and somebody tells a story, and that triggers one I think of, and I tell a story, and some of them are jokes, and the jokes can be told any way you like. But there is a core of information that is amongst the stories which the community tells, which encapsulates their identity, and those stories must be told with great care because they are already known, and if you don't tell them right, a chorus of voices will correct you. And so you are very careful to tell them right, because if you are publicly corrected, you are publicly shamed. And to be publicly shamed is very humiliating in a shame-pride culture. Community life is controlled not by right and wrong, abstract ideas of principle. Johnny, that's wrong. No, it's, hey, shame. Now we have some of that. Shame on you, Johnny. Do that which stimulates pride, stimulates honor, and avoid that which triggers shame. And this is a community concept, a community sense. And it's a very, very powerful way by which the community passes on that which they consider noble in traditional cultures. And it's very, very strong in the Middle East. So if you are going to presume to tell one of the stories which forms the identity of the community, you are very careful to tell it in a way that the community, by the seat of their pants, will sense that it is being told right. Now, what do we have in the contemporary Western debate? Contemporary, I mean the last 50 years. There are two views, and one is I have called informal, uncontrolled oral tradition, and this is Bultmann and friends, and namely rumor transmission, and there's nothing left. And you're all familiar with this argument. The Scandinavians have answered, and this is Gerhardsen. The older man was Reisenfeld with a half a dozen essays, and then Gerhardsen with a massive tome that you may have seen that he wrote 30 years ago. He's still alive and still writing, called Memory and Manuscript, and he has a great effort in which he says, no, Jesus is a rabbi. Look at the Talmud, look at the Mishnah. The Jews passed on great massive blocks of memorized data, which finally got written down in their documents, and these massive blocks of memorized data went on for centuries, even hundreds of years, decades and centuries before it was finally written down. And Jesus, being a rabbi, his students would have the same care over the things he had to say as other rabbis, as students of other rabbis cared about what those rabbis had to say. And so he's made this massive effort. His major book came out in Europe at the height of the power of the Bultmannian movement, and so was kind of poo-pooed. It's beginning in some circles to be starting to be taken seriously again, and the man is still writing, and he had his critics. He wrote a second volume trying to answer to them. But he's saying Jesus is a rabbi, and we're talking about formal, controlled oral tradition. Okay, I followed this debate now for the last 35 years and have looked at it carefully. In the last 5 years, I've published 3 essays on the subject. The last one was in Expository Times last September, so it's fairly recent. Also in a journal in England, which was much longer. They gave me 12,000 words, which was a year ago, January, in a journal called Themelios, a Anglican evangelical journal. But my case is that no, informal control oral tradition doesn't make sense in our Middle Eastern world because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are too much the same. And formal controlled oral tradition is very helpful, but is not the last word because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are too different. So what do we have? We've got the Haflat Samad. This is the concrete reality of how Middle Easterners pass on their tradition. Now what happens in the Haflat Samad? If you recite poetry, it's got to be very precise. If you recite Proverbs, you can't change a word. But if you tell the stories of the community that form the community identity, you are then given a certain freedom to give it your own twist within limits. And the community senses the limits that they will allow you. And if you violate those limits, then there will be the chorus of voices which says you're not telling it right. You will be publicly shamed and someone else will tell it. And so in these essays, I've tried to analyze how this functions, the kinds of stories that they have, the way this control functions. And so I end up with informal. There's no official teacher. You've got an official teacher over here, an official students, and sometimes a place where they meet. No, this is the gathering of the community at night. No official teacher, no official students. But a very serious thing is happening, namely you're passing on those stories which tell us who we are. Now, Bultmann wrote and convinced his students and tried to tell everybody that the early Christians were not interested in history. Okay, now put yourself back into this Jewish Christian community from the resurrection up until the fall of Jerusalem, living in the Holy Land before they immigrated out over across to Pella. Here's a 40-year period. They are Jews, and many of their family and community around them have not believed in Jesus as the Messiah. They have. They do this funny little thing on the first day of the week, and their neighbors and their relatives ask them, "What are you doing?" "We are breaking bread, drinking wine, and remembering the Messiah." Well, who was he? Jesus of Nazareth. Why do you think he was the Messiah? Now, the only answer you have is to tell the stories of what Jesus said and did. Now, if you don't know those, can't remember them, and are not interested in them, then you are not interested in who you are. You are not interested in your own identity. Now, to dismiss this is so outrageous. It's stupid. This crowd has lost touch with reality. They're telling me the moon is made out of green cheese. And, I just, give us a break. Just give me a break. And then I look at this sheet we're now looking at. Here we are on page 22. And I'm listening to a very sophisticated Jewish debate between Jews who have affirmed Jesus as the Messiah and Jews who don't. And the stuff is memorized and written down coming from Jesus of Nazareth as he initiates this debate. I am the presence of God in the community, through whom, let's go the minimalist route for purposes of discussion. I am the unique agent of God through whom God is fulfilling the promise he gave to Ezekiel and Jeremiah that one day he would come and he would round up the flock himself. And I am God acting in your midst when I round up the lost. And those who heard this and said, "You're right," and followed, they remembered it the way he told it, and the nuances of that Jewish debate are very faithfully preserved in the text, and here it is. The differences between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I hear my village friends telling the stories of their own identity, and I catch the nuances of what is allowed and what is not allowed. And so we have both authenticity and freedom for individual interpretation of the tradition. Now, let's imagine that 2,000 years from now, scholars in Afghanistan decide that they're going to make a study of John Kennedy. They don't know very much English, but they know enough to at least read documents. So they find out that the youth of America in the 60s saw Kennedy as the youngest president we'd ever had. The Catholics saw him as the first Roman Catholic who was ever president. The business community saw him as the son of a millionaire. The academics saw him as a graduate of Harvard who could read 14,000 words a minute and had written half a dozen books. The Irish saw him as an Irish immigrant who made good. The veterans saw him as the captain of a PT boat who rescued his crew. The Afghanistans come to the conclusion that there are obviously out there 6 different John Kennedys, and that thereby these are mythological creations by these communities who satisfied their own needs by creating these mythologies. Now, to sort out, will the real John Kennedy please stand up? Very difficult because there are 6 of them, and they're all mythological. So the only thing you can do is to apply rigorous historical, rational techniques to try and discover the true John Kennedy. This is finally discovered by these Afghani scholars, and they come to the conclusion that his name was not Kennedy, it was Kundi, which is a Kurdish name. And, and that the family, when they immigrated from northern Iraq, the immigration officers, what's your name? Kundi, and that didn't make any sense. The guy wrote down Kennedy. It's got all you do is change the vowels. And then the mythologies emerged. The family was actually Zoroastrian. And this shows up in the sort of, the passing of the torch and the eternal flame on his tomb. And so, having dismissed the method, dismissed all of the illusions out there and all of these mythologies created by the various communities around him, which satisfied their own needs by the creation of these mythologies, we have at last gotten down to the Kurdish Zoroastrian. Now, this is the way I look at this crowd. I've just finished reading a book by the author I can't now remember, but really good book about Lincoln. I'm a Civil War buff, and so I enjoy reading good books about the Civil War. And this one, Lincoln in American Memory. And of course, half of what we know about Lincoln is what is called recollections. The people around him who remembered the stories that he told and what he said at key events. The same was true of Lee. Historians can tell you what Lee was doing every hour of the Civil War. Where did they get that information? The people around Lincoln and Lee knew that they were experiencing earth-shaking events critical to the life of our country, critical to our people as a people. And in each case, they knew that the person, Lincoln or Lee, was a major figure in those events. And that sensitivity, that awareness, earth-shaking events are happening, and we are observing a key figure in those earth-shaking events, sort of, permanently implanted on the memories of the people around them, the things that these people said and did. And so on both sides, there was this tremendous corpus of recollections. Okay, so what do we find out of those recollections? Well, Lincoln, some saw him as the great emancipator, blacks and others. Others saw him as the man who saved the Union. Others saw him as the humble man with no background, no education, who with hard work he managed to make it to the top. Others saw him as the ideal Democrat, someone who was willing even to submit himself to an election in the midst of a war, knowing that he may well lose. And he believed in democracy deeply enough that he was willing to let that process happen and willing to surrender power even at a very critical stage in which it probably would have been a disaster if he had lost that election. And others see him as the ideal, sort of the, not ideal, but as exemplary American, a man who stood for the highest values of what the new emerging, the Europeans primarily saw him this way, emerging civilization. What are the good qualities of what American life stands for? You look at Abraham Lincoln and you find them. 5 different Abraham Lincolns. And nobody bats an eye. They're all 5 true. And so the literature that was written about Abraham Lincoln in particularly the first 50 years after his death come from these various points of view. Nobody bats an eye. Okay, so we've got Gospels that do the same thing. What's the problem? Let's get real. I was talking about this when I was down at Fuller teaching, now almost 20 years ago, the winter of 75, 76, and I was still developing these ideas, and presented them in a small seminar. I forget what church it was, and one of the people there was an American who was doing a doctorate in history on George Washington. And he said, Dr. Bailey, he told me who he was, and he said, I'm doing a PhD thesis on George Washington. And he said, you have more historically reliable information about Jesus of Nazareth than I have about George Washington. And I said, as a trained historian, that is a very remarkable statement for you to make, and I'd like you to explain yourself. He said, I'm dealing with the published and unpublished journals of people who knew George Washington. And I have no idea whether there are no controls. I have no idea whether the people who wrote these journals are trying to get elected, show off to their grandchildren, or telling the truth. While George and I, things were tough that winter, and George was a good friend of mine, and he said, Ken, I think we've got to throw it in. Valley Forge is getting to me. And I said, George, you hang in there because, we're going to make it. And George said to me, you really think that's true, Ken? I said, yeah, I think you ought to give it one more go. You get a lot of votes that way, if nobody knows any different. And he said, this fellow said, here I am trying to sort out, as I read these journals, whether or not these conversations ever took place. Whether this information is of any use at all, because I have absolutely no controls. You are talking about information that is recited in public to a community that already knows these stories. And there are controls. The information you have about Jesus of Nazareth is historically more reliable than the information we as Americans have about George Washington. Okay, the Hufflet Summit, when you come to these folks, they tell me about the origins of their village. And they say, when the Romans came, we went to the mountains and hid in those caves. And our women went down to the river at night and brought water to us. It was not safe for us, the men, to go down. The Romans would have killed us. They're talking about the 3rd century and the Diocletian persecution. And they tell it in the present tense. And they've told that story for the last 1,700 years. And you can jolly well tell it right if you presume to tell it. Because if you don't, they'll drive you out of the village. Okay, now here we're talking about, George Bush in 1964 trying to get elected, shook hands with somebody who had shaken hands with Abraham Lincoln. In 1864. As a young man of 14, he was now 114. And Bush was really quite impressed that 100 years later he shook hands with an eyewitness to George Washington. We all know that Abraham Lincoln, sorry. Stack it up to old-timers disease. Old-timers disease. Yeah, there we go. The audience corrects the oral tradition. Fantastic. So but I know that they're talking about the time of persecution before the 4th century. They don't know that. All they say is min zaman, once long ago. Then the next story they tell about Saladin. I know that's the 13th century. And the next story is about back when we spoke Coptic, and I know that's 14th century. And here in the Gospels, we're talking about stories that are, what, 40, 50, 60 years old? No big deal. This sociological structure was intact up to the fall of Jerusalem. After the fall of Jerusalem, these Jewish Christian villages were broken up and the people were scattered, but the adults who grew up listening to this could retell these stories as long as they lived. Now, we have everybody open, which if you have Gospels with you, open to the opening verses of Luke. You all know this text very well. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative. Just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. The word here in Greek is huperetes, and huperetes is the Greek dress of the Jewish word chazan. And we've got one definite article and two words. Now, 99.9% of the cases in Greek grammar, when you have one definite article and then two nouns, that one definite article governs both of them. And so we don't have an absolutely tight case because there are a few rare cases in Greek literature in which this doesn't apply, but it is so overwhelming on the other side that we can safely proceed with it. So it's the eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So these are the same people. The word huperetes, think Jewish. Chazan, who was the chazan in the synagogue? This was the person who was the number 2 in the synagogue. The head of the synagogue was called Rosh Kanisho. And in a synagogue, particularly the diaspora, was not necessarily the person who led worship. Also in Jewish Palestinian Judaism, the same thing. And the Palestinian Judaism and Hellenistic Judaism was much more intertwined than we used to think in the past, before the work of Martin Hengel, who pointed out the extent of the penetration of Hellenism into Palestine in the 1st century. And there's more and more evidence of this showing up in excavations in Israel in our days. So there was much more of the same structure in both kinds of synagogues than we thought of in the past. What does the Chazan do? This Chazan, he leads the worship, runs the Hebrew school if there is one, is responsible for the scrolls, responsible for the building, does what the head of the synagogue, the Rosh Kanisho, tells him to do, and is the sort of the one paid employee, basically. Now, the scrolls are kept in the ark, which is in a cupboard right in the middle of the synagogue. When it comes time to read the scripture, he gets the key out of his pocket and he opens the scrolls out and he gets them out and he passes them to whoever is selected to do the reading and stands there. Don't mess with it. It costs us a lot of money. And then as soon as you get done, you give it back to him and he rolls it up in the sight of everybody, puts it back in the ark, and he locks it up. And in the 4th chapter of Luke, we find this happening and the word is used. Jesus reads from the scroll and he gives it back. He rolls it up. He gives it back to the huperete. Sure, he's standing right there. We call it gives it back to the attendant. Okay, now here we have Luke getting his information from the eyewitnesses who were also chazanim. Of what? Of the synagogue? No. Of the word. Now, they don't have any buildings yet. These are now Jewish Christians. And it seems that the early Jewish Christian community chose special people to be the chazan for them in their meetings. Just like the synagogue across the street had a chazan. We don't have any buildings, so he's not the chazan of the synagogue. But we call him a chazan of the word, and he is not allowed to have this title unless he is an eyewitness to the historic Jesus. What does he do? Well, the chazan across the street is responsible for scrolls. We don't have any. Why does he have to be an eyewitness? When we gather in worship, Ken can preach, but Ken can't stand up and say Jesus said or Jesus did because he's not an eyewitness. We call on the chazan, who is an eyewitness, to stand up and say Jesus said and Jesus did, and then Ken can say whatever he likes. That's fine. Anybody can comment and reflect on it. But these special people will be the people who will recite the tradition for us when we gather together in worship. And we're very careful about the preservation of this tradition, and we give this to special people with a title which we modify from the Jewish community, we who are Jewish, Messianic Jews, if you please, and they have to be eyewitnesses. All right. Now, Paul is not considered one of these. He's an eyewitness to the resurrection, but he's not an eyewitness to the historical Jesus. And so he is not authorized to recite the tradition. He can reflect on it, but he cannot recite it. This is why we don't have the parables in Romans, Galatians, and Corinthians. Hints and bits and pieces of them. Themes, yes. Theology, yes. He follows the rules. And Bultmann said, well, the stuff wasn't dreamed up yet. That's why he doesn't quote it. No. The community is a little more careful than to allow anyone, especially if you're going to write a document. We don't let you quote this. All right, now what are you going to do when these people start to die off? Crisis. Are you going to allow chazanim of the word who are not eyewitnesses to recite in community? And of course, in the Jewish tradition, it's much better if you have somebody recite it than read a document. Why? Because they preferred to have the sacred material in oral form for two very clear reasons. And one which they enunciate in the Talmud. They say, because if it's oral and not written, then first of all, you can control who hears it. I can look out and decide whether or not this crowd is worthy to hear these sacred things, and then I will recite or not recite. And second, you can assure that there is opportunity for interpretation to be sure you got it straight before I recite it. Every one of us has a personal story that is sacred to us that we keep oral. We do not write it down. And we recite it only to those we deem worthy of hearing it, and we recite it only on occasions when there is the possibility of interpretation. That sacred tradition, too sacred to write down, is something that every one of us as individuals knows and experiences. All right, that personal experience known to every human being since Adam is a part of the way the Middle Eastern Jewish tradition, their attitude toward their sacred tradition. So here's the Christian community. If we keep this in oral form, then we are able to control who hears it, and we can assure that there's interpretation. But the people we have selected to do this, the eyewitnesses and huperetes chazan of the word, are dying off. Are we going to allow non-eyewitnesses to recite? Big decision. Answer, no. It is too sacred to allow non-eyewitnesses to recite it. What's the other option? Write it down. So they authorize documents. Luke says, I talked to eyewitnesses, and the eyewitnesses are not just sources for his gospel. They are a review committee that will vote like this or like this. And if they vote like this, he dreamed up half that stuff. We never gave that to him. He made it up. He brought it in from other sources we don't know where. He fiddled with it. It's not the way we recite it. We don't know where he got that stuff. It's his ideas and not the ideas of Jesus. If this is the vote, there will never be a second copy of the Gospel of Luke. Never. It will be stillborn. Okay, in a sense, I've had, the last 40 years, a certain freedom, as my friends have pointed out to me, because I've wrestled with these issues in an atmosphere in which I'm free to search out the truth and not have to go to professional meetings and get clobbered by all those windmills. But, I come out of 60 years of listening to people tell stories about Hadrian. And then I look at this crowd which says nobody can remember anything for 5 minutes. And I did my doctorate under hard-nosed German Lutherans who would say to the students, recite one paragraph that your grandfather told you. You can't do it. And then they would, feed the students all these Bultmannianism. And there I am sitting there with the steam coming out my nose, knowing that if I open my mouth and let it come out my mouth, they won't pass me. So you got to keep your mouth shut until you graduate and get your degrees, which I did manage to do. But out of this world, then I look at all of this junk that's floating around. And I read Crossan's book on Jesus of Nazareth, the history of a Galilean peasant, of a Mediterranean peasant. If he met a Mediterranean peasant, he wouldn't recognize me. It's the faintest idea what they look like. Faintest idea. It's very curious. I look at the Western academic scene. It's very, very curious. We know that Germans, French, and English are different. I remember in Athens airport about a couple years ago, I was going through it, and behind the desk of the transfer desk, there was a little sign which said, "Heaven is where the police are English, the cooks are French, the mechanics are German, the lovers are Greek, and it's all organized by the Swiss." Hell is where the cooks are English, the mechanics are French, the police are German, the lovers are Swiss, and it's all organized by the Greeks. Okay. Now, if I told you you all laughed. You all got it. If I told you a similar story about the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Syrians, and the Lebanese, you would not laugh. That's a complete unknown to us. Okay, so Northern Europe, the Germans, the French, and the English, we know their nationalistic characteristics, and we know that they have literature which reflects their cultural value systems, and that they're quite different. And somebody cannot read English literature and claim to be somebody who understands the German soul. No, you got to read German literature. And that anybody who reads English literature and thinks they've got a hold of the German soul is crazy. They're just absolutely crazy. They're stupid. When we get to Southern Europe, the Greeks, the Italians, the Semitic Middle East, it all somehow fuses, and we can't sort them out. We're not wired. We just can't sort them out. So Crossan thinks that the entire Middle Eastern basin is one cultural phenomenon. Southern Europe and the Middle East. The whole presupposition of his title shows, with all apologies to a brilliant man, he's stupid. Now, I sit there reading his book and saying, he did a lot of work, very hard work. He's a very intelligent man. There's no doubt about that. I used to worry about, as a Roman Catholic, how does he still go to Mass? Then I found he doesn't. He's left the church. He destroys all of the evidence, and he ends up by saying Jesus was a cynic. Like Crossan. This happened 100 years ago, in which von Harnack wrote this great 2-volume work in German on the parables, and he said the church has completely misunderstood the parables. The parables have nothing to do with theology. There's no dogma back there. They are strictly ethics, only ethics. So you sort of extract out of what is the ethics behind all of these various stories which Jesus told, and you put them together and you get a middle-class German professor. Okay, so now the same thing has happened again. All in the name of objective scientific scholarship, of course. Of the highest quality, of course. And it's off the wall. You know, for somebody who's spent 60 years living in this community, the moon is made of green cheese. They're trying to tell me this. It isn't, sorry. Now, for us in the church, I find this so critical. That's why I put the energy into it, and that's why I published these essays on the subject. If we are asking people, believe in Jesus, and they say, well, what did he do, and who is he, and what did he say? Well, I'm sorry, we really don't know. All we have is stories made up at the end of the first century by Greek minds. And you want me to believe in him and follow him? You don't even know who he is? And you don't know what he said? The nerve of everything we stand for and believe in is gone. It's cut. Now, these people, this is their deliberate intent. For them, the nerve was cut. Crossan is trying to justify his having abandoned the Christian faith and left the priesthood. And so he ends up writing this book, and you know they've sold 100,000 copies or something. There's a lot of people out there who have walked out of the church and who have decided that they want something that will justify this, and Crossan's book looked like it does. And so it looks like a big deal. And it's off the wall. No, it's absolutely off the wall. It has absolutely no touch with reality in our kind of Middle Eastern world. These people are telling stories about Saladin and telling stories about what happened 1,000 years ago. And we're talking about 40, 50, 60 years. And here we've got Jewish Christianity, you know, just absolutely loud and clear. We listen in on a profound, very sophisticated, profoundly rabbinic debate about reinterpretation of the tradition, and does Jesus bring that tradition to its finest expression, or doesn't he? And Jesus, who says, I am the one through whom God is acting to fulfill these promises, and some say yes and some say no. But the fabric of the discussion is sophisticated and completely Jewish. And they had a technique for its preservation, and the most profound reason for remembering that you can imagine. They're not just remembering an Abraham Lincoln or a John Kennedy. They're remembering the Messiah of God. The most important decision they ever made in their life was to decide that what he had to say was true. And particularly the people who founded the village. And they'll talk about, well, you're asking about how our village is founded. Well, of course, our village is a very young village. It's only 450 years old. And then they tell you the stories of the founder. Only 450 years old. You know, we don't count things antiquities unless they're at least 2,000 years old. That's kind of new stuff. Old stuff is 3,000 years old, and 4,000 is quite old, and 10,000, those are antiquities. So, you know, our Middle Eastern friends come to California and somebody shows them their antiques, and they're very polite, very, very polite. Oh, this chair's 50 years old. Oh, that's very old. Very polite, yeah, very polite. Again, what I think, and redaction criticism, I engage in. I think is a legitimate quest. How, by the way, this Haflat Samad has no historical order to it. They do not remember events happening in order. And so as you take material out of this authoritative tradition, recited with a flexibility, you can arrange it any way you like. Any way you like. And you can take bits and pieces and leave bits and pieces, and you can put bits and pieces together. But the building blocks they must recognize as being authentic to the tradition. Considerable freedom is allowed, and thereby it is possible, even as our recollections of both Abraham Lincoln and of John Kennedy allows us to see him through the eyes of who we are. And the youth did see Kennedy as a young man, and the Catholics were enormously proud of the fact that he was Catholic. And you can remember the Irish and how excited they were that an Irishman made it to the top. All of that is there. But that doesn't mean that they create stories about John Kennedy out of thin air because of who they are and because of their needs. I got started on this when I began my critical study of the New Testament after seminary. graduate work with Marcus Barth in Pittsburgh. And Marcus, son of Karl Barth. And he kept, I didn't understand, this was back in 65, and I didn't understand how important, because I wasn't really into Montanism at that time, and really hadn't hit the fans in this country. And so I didn't understand how important what he was saying really was. I heard it, but later on I figured out how weighty this was. He kept pounding the table and saying, if you have established that the Christian community at a certain period in its life found certain sayings of Jesus meaningful for their life, you have not established that they created them. And then another thing that really, the Jesus seminar starts off, we don't let you in the door. You can't even sit with us unless you are willing to affirm the idea of I forget the technical phrase they use for it, that dissimilarity. The criterion of dissimilarity. Yeah. Namely, if a saying of Jesus looks like early Christianity, then they probably, the evangelist borrowed it from early Christianity to put it into the mouth of Jesus. If it looks like Judaism, they probably borrowed it out of Judaism and put it into the mouth of Jesus. Now, what is this really saying? He was not a Jew. No Christian ever listened to him. And I had a dream last night, and so Pharaoh is looking for Joseph. Now, I will tell you the dream, and then perhaps you can help me interpret it. I dreamed that 2,000 years from now, historians in the University of Khartoum in the Sudan decided that they would make a historical study of John Kennedy. So they gathered all the materials they could about JFK, and then decided that, of course, the criterion of dissimilarity would be essential if they were going to get at the real John Kennedy. So that means that, first of all, they had to examine the Democratic Party from 1860 to 1960, which they did, and that thereby anything in the sayings and speeches of John Kennedy that was in harmony with the Democratic Party up until 1960, of course, cannot be given any credence because it's taken out of the Democratic Party and put into his mouth. They then discovered that there was a crowd of people who followed John Kennedy called the Kennedyites, led by his brother Robert. And of course, anything that the followers of John Kennedy represent could not possibly be authentically from John Kennedy, and so thereby all of that material had to also be taken out. Now, what they had left was a very few little pieces of tradition. They then found that John Kennedy had speechwriters, and so then it was very critical to try and find out what of this material was from the speechwriters and what may have been from John Kennedy. And so they began this rigorous, scientific, objective, historical research. They wrote hundreds of books and thousands of articles, and 100 years later, they had not progressed very far in their search for the authentic John Kennedy, but that they had discovered there was such a man. His name was John Kennedy. He died, probably shot. The search continues.